Hi, I'm Chris Wolf, co-director of the Thomas International Center, and we're continuing with our course, our short course, on the goals of American government and the Declaration of Independence. And in particular, at this point, we're continuing with our discussion of some of the alternative conceptions of what government is about. We've looked at the Declaration and its self-evident principles and the modern political philosophy and what it's based. And we're also now going to look at the classical approach. We've begun to look at the classical approach to politics, and we've seen that it has somewhat different origin and a different understanding, perhaps, of the ultimate end of government. So we'll continue with that. Last class I was talking about the family as a kind of analogy by which we can understand the common good somewhat better. Because we've seen that the family tries to provide a material well-being. Parents try to provide material well-being for the children, but they don't stop there. You know, intellectual and moral virtue, a good life is something that every parent wishes for his or her child. And so I was talking about some of the different ways in which parents do that. And they start out especially by trying to give their kids good habits when they're young. Because when human beings are young, they don't necessarily understand virtue, but they are capable of picking up habits by repeating the same actions consistently. And so parents, for example, can teach children to be temperate by making sure that they don't eat too much food or too much sweet food or whatever, but have some kind of regulation in their food so that they're able to control their appetite. Likewise with anger and other things. So these habits develop early by repeated action that the parents get the kids to do. Now the key in parenthood, though, and it's a very difficult transition, but often a rewarding one, is that the parents have to hand off that responsibility for the direction of life to their children. That is, as the children get older, rather than simply making them do something, you can't eat in between meals, or you can't eat that, or too much of that, or whatever. At a certain point in time, it becomes appropriate and really necessary for the child to have more and more freedom, for the child to make the choices. This is what adolescence is typically about. And often parents discover that the choices aren't always made very well. Kids are still trying to navigate this new life of freedom, but they learn with the guidance of their parents, especially if there's an affectionate relationship with them. They learn to take responsibility for their own lives. They also, at that time, it's very important for them to understand the point behind what they're doing. That is, they have to understand why it is that it's virtuous to live this way rather than that way. For instance, to be able to control our appetites rather than being controlled by them. And so parenthood involves this attempt to foster excellence, but in a way that increasingly transfers the responsibility for that excellence to the children. Now, where this analogy breaks down and where it's weak is precisely the fact that parenthood is a kind of authority that aims precisely at making itself no longer necessary. It's the goal of parenthood, parental authority, is in a way to put itself out of business. That is, if parenthood is successful, then the children are raised in such a way as to take over their own responsibility for directing their lives, and the parents, at a certain point in time, will no longer have authority over their children. The children will be self-directing. So that's a difference between parental authority and political authority. Now, the way political authority in the classical view is similar is that while the polis, the political community, wants to make sure that the material well-being of the citizenry is ensured, it's not just concerned with that. It's also concerned with the quality of life, the good life, the virtue, the excellence of its citizens. And I mean, this shows itself in many different ways, but to take one example. The political community is different from parental authority because that never expires. The political community is always going to persist, and to try to provide a framework, a kind of moral ecology that fosters human excellence. And like parental authority, the political community doesn't want to just coerce people into being good. The classical world didn't think that it was simply a question of forcing people to be good. The political community was trying to foster an atmosphere in which people could recognize human excellence and strive for human excellence, and that meant, moral excellence as well as, different other kinds, physical excellence, for example. So the political community would certainly want to avoid what you might call infantilism on one side, that is, reducing the community to children by just making them do a certain thing. The political community, like parents, wants to form its people in order to be good, self-directing people. But in a way, it never goes out of existence. The political community is always there in the background, providing a framework which helps people, assists them in pursuing an excellent human life. Moreover, the classical political thinkers thought that you could judge a community precisely on the basis of the way of life that it tended to encourage. Of course, at the time of the original thinkers we're talking about, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, we're talking especially about the city-states of Greece, relatively small, somewhat more homogeneous communities, where it was in some ways easier to see a specific way of life. And you could say that you could identify different cities by the ways of life that they encouraged. So for example, Sparta had a very definite way of life. It was a way of life oriented toward military virtue, toward courage especially. Athens was different. It was a more commercial society, a society that focused more on certain kinds of intellectual abilities or talents, on the arts, and in some ways a somewhat wider range of human goods. But that Athenian way of life was, like the Spartan way of life, something distinctive. And you might judge a particular community, a polis, on the basis of what kind of life it encouraged people to live, what the dominant way of life of the community was. And so that's the first analogy to kind of get across what the common good is. Just as the family is concerned not just about the material well-being, but also the moral quality of the life of its children, and especially that they become virtuous, self-directing adults. Likewise, according to classical political philosophy, the polis, the political community, wanted to provide circumstances that made it possible for people to develop virtue and excellence, to become really great human beings. Okay, that's the first analogy. Second analogy is the analogy of the sports team. Now, why does this help us to understand the common good? What's interesting about a sports team is that it's not simply a question of the individual excellence of its members. We probably, those of us who have played sports, team sports at any time, are aware of the fact that you can have a team that has a certain number of individuals. Let's take basketball as an example. A team that has 5 individuals who are outstanding in their individual basketball talents, their shooting, their rebounding, their passing, their defense, so forth. And yet, we probably, those of us who have played a sport like that, recognize that sometimes a team with 5 really great individuals ends up not being as good a team as another group of 5 individuals which may not have quite the individual talents that the first team has, but they work more effectively as a team together. And that teamwork can sometimes cover over or exceed in its results the individual excellence of the members of the team. Another interesting thing about the sports team is that it has two purposes which aren't necessarily opposed, but they're analytically distinguishable. The first and obvious thing that a team aims for is victory. In a given sport, there's a way you win, that you come out on top. So in basketball, you want to end that game with more points than your opponent. In tennis, you want to end up with more games and sets in order to win the match, and so forth. So the extrinsic goal, you might say, of a sports team is winning. You know, that there's this goal of achieving a certain external goal, which is winning the particular contest. There's another dimension, though, of sports as well, and that is simply the intrinsic goal of a beautiful performance, of producing an excellent form of activity. And so it's interesting, again, those of us who have played sports might think back to times when, let's say, we played a basketball game and we won the basketball game, but maybe we did it against a team that wasn't very good, and the actual quality of our play during the game wasn't all that great. Whereas we can look back on another occasion and we had a very hard-fought struggle against another team that was really good, and in the end we lost. So in a way we failed to achieve the extrinsic goal of winning the game, and yet we played really well. We were participants in this really, really fine game. And I guess most of us, I think, in those positions would be much happier playing the game where we eventually lost but played really well, played a really great game, rather than winning a game but doing it against a weak opponent where the quality of our play is not all that great. The activity itself, the skillful performance itself is very much part of the goal of what we're doing. In some ways, I think you could argue it's actually the ultimate goal of that activity, even more important than the external goal of winning. Although, of course, the excellence is connected with the goal of winning. I mean, that's partly how you judge excellence, right? That you have to do the things that are necessary to win. So, if you ask, is a team a really good team? You don't look just at the component parts of it, just at the individuals. You look at the way the team works together, and you look at the quality of their common activity together. And that, again, gives us some sense, I think, of what a common good might be. That it's not just the sum of some individual goods, the sum of the talents of the individuals. It's also the way everything meshes, the way it fits together, and the ultimate whole that it produces. Now, how does this get reflected in politics? How is it that excellence or virtue becomes a central feature of political life? Well, let's take some examples. Certainly in Greece, one of the major forms of common activity in which virtue was outstanding was war. It's a lamentable fact of life that so often such great virtue is shown in an activity that can have such baleful consequences for human beings. War is something that, in general, we would like to avoid if we could, because it involves terrible harms. But it's also undeniable that it is an occasion for an arena of, a theater of extraordinary human virtues, which call forth our admiration for people and the way they live their lives. So, for example, you look at, let's say, the Iliad or the Odyssey, and we see Homer describing the great deeds that many of the Greeks did in battle, the Iliad especially about Achilles. And that description calls forth our admiration because of the great human excellence and the great virtue of the people who are involved. Of course, often, that's tempered also by certain kinds of tragic faults that people may have that may undermine the quality of their virtues, as in the case of Achilles. And there are, of course, many ups and downs in warfare, and there are some things that are very unattractive. But the Greeks saw that as really central to life. They saw it as an occasion for exercising a very high level of virtue. And that virtue was an important part of judging a particular polis, a particular political community. But let's move on to something that's perhaps not quite as much a source of ambivalence in our feelings, because if we could have a world without war, which will never happen, in some ways that might be ideal. But there are other things where you wouldn't say the same thing. Let me turn to another example, and I want to cite an example from a book by a 20th century political theorist named Eric Voegelin. Wrote a book called The New Science of Politics, and at one point he has a description of activities in Athens which may convey some kind of sense of what it means to talk about a truly shared common good. What Voegelin talks about is Greek drama. We know there are great Greek dramatists like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and he focuses on Aeschylus's play The Suppliants. And to give an oversimplified version of the plot of The Suppliants, basically you have a woman who's running from the sons of Aegyptus, and she arrives at Athens and basically asks for what we would call political asylum. Please protect me. And she appeals to the fact that she is descended from the same gods that Athens is descended from. So in some sense, there's a kind of moral obligation that one owes to kin, to relatives. The city leaders in Athens quickly come to the conclusion that really there's a moral obligation for them to provide assistance to this woman, to provide her with protection. And yet, they also recognize that, hey, there are armies, coming after her, and protecting this woman might actually endanger the very preservation of the polis, as it's possible that, these armies might wipe out the polis. And so it's going to be an act of considerable fortitude to provide this protection, given the potential dangers that are involved. The city leaders also understand that this decision involving such incredible consequences for the city really requires that somehow the citizenry be brought into it. That it not just be that, well, the leaders decide this is what we're going to do and kind of hand that down, but that in some ways the citizens have to be kind of brought into an understanding of why it is that it is so important that the city live up to its moral obligation of providing protection. Now, where does this Greek drama occur? Well, as we know, Greek theaters were a kind of public activity. There'd be these public competitions in which different dramatists would write plays, and then there would be judging and prizes. And basically, all the cities would go down to the theater. And the theaters were very ingeniously constructed. They didn't have microphones and amplification, but they could still build a theater in such a way that if you stood in one spot on the stage, you could speak very softly and still be heard throughout a large theater. So Voegelin talks about the public life of Athens. One element was that all the citizens go down to the theater, and they sit there and they watch the theater together. They watch a play like The Suppliants. Now, we all know what it's like to watch a really good movie, a good play, a good TV show. It's something that tends to suck us in, to draw us in, so that, for example, You know, when we see a bad guy portrayed, we're angry at the bad guy. We don't like him. When we see somebody noble portrayed, we feel, you know, admiration at the nobility of that person. You know, it draws us in some ways, you know, our souls partake of the action of the drama. Now note, when the citizenry of Athens all go down to the theater and watch the suppliants, they're all being pulled into the really interesting action of this drama. You know, the appeal to the city, the danger that poses to the city, the sense of moral obligation about exactly, you know, what to do in these circumstances, the effort to persuade others in the city that the just thing to do, what decay demands, is this rather than that. The people are all kind of drawn into that action. And of course, you know, as with, you know, if you come out of a good movie, you know, you just naturally start talking with the other people you went with, you know, about, well, what about that, and what about that, or wasn't that interesting? Well, I didn't think that was so good. Didn't think that was right. You really get into a common discussion of these really important human issues, such as issues of justice. Now, what we have going on here is a political community sharing in what you could consider a perfectly shareable good. You know, if it were a question of the grain in Athens, the grain can get divvied up. You know, one family gets its share, another family gets its share. You know, you have different material things, but ultimately it ends up being divvied up. In the case of an intellectual and moral good, the intellectual good of reflecting on these important issues, the moral good of, you know, orienting your soul toward justice, you know, there's no sense there that you're simply divvying up. You know, in grain, you know, if one family has more, you know, another family has less. You know, if you're talking about intellectual and moral goods, everybody can share in those completely. The fact that somebody has a deeper share of intellectual virtue doesn't in any way mean that somebody else has to have a lesser share of it. It's one of the striking things about this kind of common good, the common good that involves material things, and especially a life of virtue, a life of human excellence, especially human intellectual and moral excellence. So this gives us some kind of sense, perhaps, of at least what the higher aspects of classical politics were. One thing I should mention in passing here, by the way, is we're talking about the theorists of politics. We're talking about Aristotle describing a goal. I'm not saying that this is the way that politics was actually conducted in the ancient world. In fact, if you go to somebody like Plutarch, who describes, you know, the actual historical events and the characters, usually pairing a life of a great Greek statesman with the life of a Roman statesman, the thing you're struck by is how much is awful in that classical politics. You know, that, you know, when we talked about backstabbing in Greece, we meant it literally. You know, in the United States, backstabbing usually means that, you know, somebody loses a position. It doesn't mean you actually have a sword going in your back. You know, in Greece, the sword going in the back was actually a rather common thing. So, you know, you have to be careful about recognizing that the description of what politics ought to be, what it aspires to be in Plato and Aristotle, doesn't always correspond to what it was in practice. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But the point is that this gives us a sense of why classical politics could be so attractive, why it could appeal to people, because it appeals to something high in us. It encourages us to strive for human excellence. And the idea that the political community, which is the kind of the horizon for life of most people, the thing that they're a part of, the life that they share together, You know, the idea that that life would encourage a life of excellence rather than a low or base life is very attractive. And that's what Aristotle and other classical thinkers argued politics should be about. It should be about achieving a higher way of life, that the common way of life of the community should involve more human excellence. It should foster human excellence. And that's a very attractive goal in many ways. Okay. Now, I have to talk now a little bit in the next class about how that changed with the coming of Christianity, how that was modified, and then ultimately why it is that the classical and medieval conception of politics gave way to a new and distinctively modern understanding. Thank you.